So welcome to this year's Incident Response panel. I have with me some of our colleagues from across the business within the sector. I'll just ask each person to give a little bit of a background to their history of what brought them to be on the panel here today. And then we'll jump into some Q&A. So we've already had some questions come in through Twitter, so we'll start off with those and just get your thinking brains going, and feel free to ask anything and anything to the panel. The main sort of, thread that we have for this is the future of incident response. So that's the sort of underlying theme for today's session. So if we start off at the end with Yotam, who has graciously stepped in at the last minute after one of our delegates was unable to attend. So thank you, Yotam.
Sure. Some of you may have seen me in the previous session, but my name is Yotam. I'm part of Signia's incident response practice. I've been managing incidents for a few years. I've been there 5 years now. And before that, I spent a few years in Israeli military doing offensive cyber before switching sides and jumping on to Signia.
Next on to John.
Hi, so John Geater. I run product and technology for Archivist, which is a platform company in the relatively new area called SCIT, which is supply chain integrity, transparency and trust. So my background is mostly in defensive cryptography and security. I work with HSMs, embedded stuff, defense and aerospace for a number of years, but recently moved over to accept the fact that you can't stop everything, but if you can detect it and get the intelligence to the right place at the right.
Thanks, John. And Zaza.
And I am Zaza Handy. I work for NTT Security. I am an incident responder. I do malware reverse engineering, kind of ready to go incident responder. My job is very dramatic, unpredictable, but very rewarding. I came here to support CREST and also to see colleagues like yourself and while enjoying the panel. So feel free to contact me after the meeting if you need to know more about me or my company, NTT.
Thanks, Zaza. And lastly, myself, David Gray. I'm also currently with Signia. My background was originally UK Royal Air Force, doing malware analysis, forensics, and after that, lots of other incident response companies, including the last one, NTT, where I had the pleasure of working.
He's my boss.
So, right, without further ado, let's get on to the questions for the panel. So we'll start with 2 questions and then we'll throw it out to the audience. Okay, so the first one is, we're talking about the future of incident response. Do we actually think there is a future, as in, what do we need to change? Anybody want to pick up on that first of all?
Yes, the future of incident response, one thing is obvious, there will be incidents, more of them. The attackers are getting very savvy. There are new technologies, they are no longer afraid because they've acquired confidence and they have better tools. The systems are faster, the internet connections are faster, they have been empowered. So it's going to get worse, their strategies have changed. So we are changing our own strategy so that we can find these things and prevent them happening. And if they do happen, we have a better response strategy to mitigate based on what is current.
Thanks, Zaza.
Yeah, so something that's very clear and is kind of the origin of me starting my company is that incidents are originating more and more deep in supply chains. This was the biggest #1 finding from the NCSC's threat report from this year, for example, and that's far from unique. So I think in terms of threat response in the future and also incident response in general, what we're going to start to find is a lot more connected and collective intelligence going into incident response, not focusing on silos, not trying to keep everything secret, but actually working together in a defensive community the same way that the offensive community is now working together as an effective group.
Yeah, I think that it's, from what we're seeing in trends doing incident response, there are 2 main things that are changing and are definitely going to continue as a main trend for the future. One is a big differentiation between the kinds of attacks that different organizations have to face. So because of the commoditization of a lot of these attacks, like ransomware, that are relatively easy to perform, low sophistication, versus high-end financial theft or nation-state level attacks, what we're seeing is that some organizations are just beyond the point where they're interesting for the small scale or easy to do attacks, because there are so many others that can be targeted. So why work hard to do a ransomware attack when you can have it easy against another organization? While the other kinds of attacks are becoming more prevalent, the ones that are financial theft from banks or other financial organizations, and the ones that have to do with nation-state level threats. And so I think that's one, like, we're really seeing a divergence. Like, these attacks are becoming less common to each other, and they're really becoming different sectors, and we need to respond effectively accordingly. And I think the second thing is, obviously, with the move of more and more organizations to the cloud, I think the major impact that has is not just the speed of attacks, which is obviously much greater in the cloud, but also just adapting to new attack surfaces continuously. So a lot of organizations have done these kind of switches without fully understanding that it's not necessarily less secure, it's just different. And you need to be ready for this new attack surface in order to defend against these attacks. And we're seeing attackers leveraging this all the time, that organizations just haven't fully done this kind of mental switch. And I'm sure that's going to be a key focus in the next few years.
Yes.
Nice. So yeah, Yotam, you're talking about trends. Obviously, we've seen lots of changes in IR the last couple of years with the rise of ransomware as a service. What other sort of trends do you think that you're seeing from daily operations for the three of you?
Yes, ransomware is they are my babies. I investigate them almost like sometimes 2 a day. One thing that became obvious late last year is the code that they used to write ransomware have evolved. It has changed. They are now using the Go language, which is more robust and malware friendly, because they are very good at evading things like antivirus software and even your EDR. When we respond to incident, we use EDR, and I make it my objective to test the malware with every EDR before I say to a customer, oh, you trust this EDR, and then you install it to protect yourself during the incident. And right before me, I ran this ransomware with an EDR installed, and then I saw it crunch every file there, including the file that was supposed to be used to test for ransomware by the vendor. So why is this happening? The Go language, they have it can be used it can be compiled into different operating systems like Linux, Windows, Mac, and they have tools that enable them to perform this evasion. Things like Scarecrow, they can obfuscate data, they can, the EDR solution, they tend to hook into the memory to when the calls are being made by every process. So what these Go language tools are capable of doing is they can unhook it. So if you are trusting your EDR all the time, it's time to change your playbook. And in addition to that, the ransomware attackers, the attackers themselves, we used to have, one extortion, they encrypt your data, they demand money. Many years ago, they wouldn't even encrypt, it would just look like encrypted. But now, they will encrypt, then we went to double extortion. Now we are on the third triple extortion, whereby they encrypt. They tell you if you don't pay, they will expose your data. Now, they will threaten to attack you with DDoS if you don't pay, or escalate to your third-party company. Anybody who does business with you, with your name on it, they will attack them, and they will let them know why they are attacking. So they are very empowered now, and they are aggressive. I was chatting with one. They wanted some company to pay 600 or thereabouts, some huge amount of money. And I simulated, and I was chatting with this attacker, and I said, how am I sure you're going to pay my company, release the data if we paid you? Oh, we're a very good business. We are reliable, he says to me. So what we are up against is an army of people who are determined to take your data, take money from you. And if you don't pay, they will make sure you pay. They are doing that because they have better tools to do that. And companies, unfortunately, are not implementing all the right security. Yeah, so,
Thanks, Zaza.
It's nice. The main thing I take from that really resonates with me is that this idea of fortress IT is dead. The idea of building a crunchy wall around all your IT systems and then defending it with antivirus has long been a bad idea, but it actually works against people now for these very reasons. The defenses actually are the thing that slows down the response team and lets all of those more social attacks happen. So I think in terms of the question of what other types of attacks are we seeing, they're very broad-based, and no matter what kind of simple technology you put in place, people will evade it, because if you put locks in place, then they'll just make sure you're locked in instead of locked out, right? And if you open the doors, then they'll make sure that things flood. There's no getting around that. So I think an additional thing that is often not discussed, but actually is much bigger cause of problems for people than simple attacks and concerted hackers, is that there are all sorts of other things that can happen that cause problems in a business that aren't necessarily an attack. You get misconfigurations, you get mistakes, you get Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock and somebody doesn't finish a script update. All of these other things that go into the incorrect operation of your computer systems can cause business problems. And I think the thing that people need to start looking at is not, oh my God, I'm so scared of ransomware right now, what can I do about ransomware? And actually look at, how do I make sure that my systems are operating correctly and respond when the behavior is wrong, as opposed to trying to respond when you think someone's attacking you. And that behavioral thing has longevity, whereas the point defense thing doesn't.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that I mentioned before some of the key changes, especially when it comes to moving to cloud environments. But as far as attackers, I think that some of the interesting changes that we're seeing is that because the attack surface is increasing, it also requires us as defenders and as incident responders to expand our scope. So we've done investigations where we had to investigate home routers in order to figure out how they first got into an environment, because they came in through an employee's home through a VPN connection. So we have investigations that came in through mobile devices or through other places where you don't usually look for. And I think that the interesting part here is the way that they're leveraging these different attack surfaces against different kinds of companies. Because another very interesting trend is also when you look not just at, we often talk about ransomware. I gave a talk about it before because it's very common and worries a lot of organizations. But when we talk about more sophisticated attacks, the nation-state level attacks, they're changing too. And there it's very interesting to see the different methods used by the different nation states. So, for example, when we look at North Korea, which for years now have been leveraging cyber attacks as a means of funding their nation, right? They are under sanctions globally, and this just works for them. We've seen attacks, apart from them also collaborating with ransomware groups, but we've seen them performing attacks that, they spend 6 or 8 months performing a social engineering campaign. Nothing very sophisticated from a technical perspective, but very sophisticated from a human engineering perspective, targeting people, talking to them through fake academic or financial accounts, really establishing a relationship before finally sending them whatever it is they wanted to send. I've seen investigations where a 6 months long cooperation, let's call it, or conversation about blockchain security with some top people at a cryptocurrency exchange led to sending one email with, now download this program so we can share some data, which contained custom malware for Mac, Linux, and Windows. From there, the hop to creating malicious transactions worth hundreds of millions from within the cryptocurrency exchange was less than 24 hours. The operation was 6 months, but that was only to get to the right person that they knew already had the right credentials. Once they were in, it was very simple. So the fact that we're seeing different nation states specialize in these new fields like cloud attacks, like cryptocurrency exchanges, this is something that every organization has to work to prepare themselves to based on the risk landscape that they're facing.
Awesome, thanks.
Yes.
Right, at this point, we'll throw it open to the audience. So there should be some microphones available. Have we got any questions that you want to ask the panel? Anyone at all?
There's somebody.
Yep. Yep, thank you.
Hi. You hear a lot about the increase in attacks on the IoT or SCADA environments. Is that something you're actually seeing happen in reality?
Yes, they do happen, but not as common as ransomware. The attackers tend to follow what they can commoditize very fast, money. So, but we do get that, but they're not very common. Oftentimes you find that it's related to nation-state attacks when they want to cripple an economy somewhere, or if some activists want to complain about something. But on a day-to-day basis, we don't see ICS-type related attacks. But we are actively monitoring them. We are aware of the malware. When we talk about ICS, people often think, is this a huge complex environment? Because prior to them being connected to the IT network, we didn't hear about attacks there. It is still the IT part of it that introduced that vulnerability. So when we do respond to ICS environment, we often find that we end up responding to the IT that connected to them. Yeah.
So I have a book on my desk at work called Securing SCADA Systems. And it was written in 2001, but if you look at the picture on the front, it looks like a 1950s industrial setting. It's got all big valves and everything's either green or grey and nothing in between. It looks desperately old-fashioned and out of date, and I'm afraid to say that's mostly where SCADA systems are at. Something that a lot of folks don't necessarily understand is that just because things share an acronym, it doesn't mean they share a design. So the idea that SCADA systems are in any way interoperable or share a common view of security is incorrect. They don't. Most of the time, they don't have any. In my former life, when I was working in the aerospace defense field, everything I touched was different. And by and large, it was only different in how none security it had. Even for things that go up in space and are supposed to stay there for 30 years, have no encryption on their payloads, for example. So I think, yes, these things happen, but I think there's very different attack profiles for IoT or SCADA, because SCADA tends to be historically ill-defended. People are absolutely trying to rectify that now, but there's a big legacy. So historically ill-defended in the technical sense, but it's also disconnected and sitting inside a compound which probably has armed guards outside it, and that's actually not a bad defense in most cases. Whereas IoT devices are almost the exact opposite. They're highly connected, and they're usually deployed out in public in the open where people can fiddle with them at will. So I think one thing that is going to be very important is actually, your case in point, separating those two things and understanding that although there's a lot of commonality in the technology, the risk that they face and represent are actually very different.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just add one thing to this, which is I think given in the IoT space, I very much relate to what Zaza said, that still most attacks, even though I've seen some pure IoT attacks, most of them are IT-OT or IT-IoT attacks still. They're a combination. And that very much has to do with just the attention that they get. So if it's low-scale IoT, like, I don't know, cameras, stuff like that, then yeah, most people just don't pay any attention to their security, and then they're easy prey. But even in large organizations, when you look at, you mentioned SCADA, but for example, I had a couple of major incidents that I responded to with large medical organizations. Now, a medical organization, let's say they have a CT, a CAT scan machine. It's 20 years old, but it works fine medically. They're not going to throw it away. It costs $1 million. But the software is also 20 years old, and it's probably running Windows XP or worse. And obviously, the producer tells them, yeah, this is not patchable anymore. This is end of life. But they have no choice but to keep it going because that's what they do, and they're not going to throw away $1 million device. So by definition, they keep in these legacy issues within their network. And then the question becomes, how do you secure around it to prevent it from becoming a problem? But it's very often a problem.
Yeah. And just from my side, if you're familiar with the Purdue model, which is the way all the IoT structure is laid out, the top three are obviously aligned to Windows-type systems, so they're all already open to every other kind of attack that we have available. So that's why, as Zaza and Yotam mentioned, that's just normal type attacks. It's when you get to the more deep, more technical attacks where that attackers have to effectively either get a copy of the software or a copy of the actual engineering tool itself to be able to reverse engineer, and that's where you start getting more targeted, more nation-state attacks. And this is a final point for me. I had a very perfect example to what you were talking about there, Yotam, for oscilloscopes that were running XP, and this was only about 2 or 3 years ago. that were infected with Windows XP. And the only way, they couldn't get rid of the oscilloscopes because they were still functioning. So it was literally just put them into a separate LAN and be able, just live with the problem because you can't reinstall XP. Thank you, sir.
I really like the phrasing of it's infected with Windows XP.
Hi, Dave myself. Declare an interest. I'm on the IET panel for DevSecOps as well as the BCS one from Treasurer. I'd encourage you all to have a look at devsecops.bcs.org for that. Just in the light of what you just said, when 571, the US Nuclear Regulatory Code, was written about 2008, they put a requirement for Windows kernel hardening in, even though there was only one product in the world, co-located at Royal Holloway, University of London. I won't name them. But the point is they were able to pre-plan for this very scenario of Armageddon you've just mentioned. Question for you though, currently FIRST are examining whether or not to put safety into their scoring for the CVSS system. What do the panel feel the future should say about the difference between security and safety, which the Germans with their Sicherheit don't seem to have as a problem?
Security and what?
Sicherheit. The Germans have the same word for security and safety. FIRST, who do the CVSS scoring, are considering removing, they've been discussing it, safety as a consideration for their scoring. What do the panel feel that the future of incident response would look like with no safety considerations?
So I don't think so a different way of asking that question is, what is an incident? Yeah. And in most cases, the incidents that we care the most about are the ones that represent a safety failure. Invariably as well, I was actually having a chat with the chap from EasyJet who did the keynote about this very thing, because in common with a lot of what we do, my business can do supply chain security for basically any supply chain, but we've got two major areas. We've got nuclear area and we've got the critical information services area. And the reason for that primarily is because the people in charge of digital transformation and information systems and security actually come from an industrial safety culture, not from an IT management culture. And it's very, very clear when you come from the safety and risk side what you should be worrying about and how you should manage your systems. And it's not if you go from the other direction. So I think, CVSS actually I think is nonsense, honestly, because, well, everything's a 10, right? If you're going to describe something at the level of this line of code has a bug in it, then the bug either exists or not. And the thing you have to decide is whether any attacker can actually access and exploit that feature. So I'm not aware of the very specific case that you're talking about, so I won't take all words into my mouth. But the idea that you discount safety from any risk scoring process or any maturity process, I would think is extremely silly.
Yes, I agree with him because at the end of the day, our lives are more important than anything really. The life first, safety first. But by the time you now map a safety to people or the citizens, the more an attacker who have the right will bring it down and cause collateral damage. So that is why both parties need to work. If it's old, think of what is the best pragmatic, less disruptive way that we can improve it. Because the fact that it's old or dysfunctional or you're managing it for years, because if you pull it, it may cause a problem. Oh, you're not hearing me? Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. I think I was okay before. we have to balance. See, I think I need to raise my voice higher. So that's why you would take back to your bosses. People who make this decision, they need to remember the safety is important to the attacker and the owner of the system. Who would win? Yep, thank you. No, I'm sure they heard me. If you didn't hear me, raise your hand. Oh, you didn't? Oh, I'll tell you later.
She just didn't hear the question right. Yeah, I agree. I think also, of course, there's a big difference between businesses that have safety concerns and one for which this is a minor or non-existent issue. So a law firm is not concerned with safety the same way that a nuclear power plant or a hospital is. But obviously for organizations for which this is a big issue, then I think it's becoming even more common to look at it as a safety issue, just because attackers are also changing a bit of their methodology. So if you look even at ransomware groups, which for many years actively came out and said, we do not target critical infrastructure, we do not target governmental organizations, we do not target hospitals, because they don't want to hurt human life, they don't want to get into that business. Many groups recently have been reducing some of these limitations on themselves and proactively going out and saying, yeah, we're now willing to also target this and target that. And we've seen, of course, targeting hospitals and other critical infrastructure. And while there are some groups who are still actively avoiding it, there are more of the larger ones who are agreeing to do this. And this is an interesting calculation for them, because their calculation has always been, we're operating as a business, we want to make as much money as possible, and we don't want to piss off the wrong people who are going to actually go after us, right? But now we're seeing organizations saying, yeah, we're going to do it anyway, just like Conti went out and said, yeah, we're officially pro-Russian government, not just under the radar. So it's very similar to this, and it's affecting critical infrastructure as well.
So,
Adrian?
Hello, I'm Adrian Ish from BA Systems. The DCMS did a UK cyber sector report this year, which has lots of interesting stats in it. I'd recommend people looking at it. One thing that jumped out to me was, I think they said there's about 1,200 companies in the UK in the cybersecurity sector, and 50% are offering incident response services. So about 600 companies in the UK are offering incident response services. Is this sustainable going forward as a market, do you think? Or how do we kind of maintain these areas being open to new entrants, but also having the sort of quality standards that I think we'd all expect from incident response?
Well, Zaza is not a business person, but from an incident responder point of view, where there is an attack and there is need for people to respond to them, people should respond to them. It doesn't matter how many companies. You can have a one-man company, a 10-man company. Some of the old existing companies, they have better leverage because they have that reputation. But the new companies, you find out that they are hungry for recognition, and they hire people, upcoming from schools, people who are young people who are upcoming in their skills.
So I guess from my point of view, if there's business from obviously the attackers, then obviously that business is going to generate more companies in the IR business. So I understand it from that perspective, but I take your point. It's how do we validate that those organisations are right and proper for the role that they're doing. And I guess that's down to each individual organisations that's hiring them. And that's where organisations like CREST come in with their validation scheme for companies, or the GCHQ scheme.
And you've also got SAN certification, where if you're hiring, you can check the person's profile, confirm. But it's not really about certification for the staff. It's about assuring that they know what they are doing. They have a verifiable skill sets that they are bringing into the company.
The other thing that's really hard with this as well is, as an incident response company, you can't go up and say, here I have all these references to talk to, because every single one of those references more than likely has been done over at some point in time. So you're never going to get that kind of validation to be able to support your business as well.
So 2 points on this. On that point, something that I really like about the Executive Order 14028 from the US, if anyone's seen from last May, the Executive Order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, one of the very low-flying requirements of that executive order is to have a fairer and more open legal environment that encourages people to admit to breaches and fix things in the open, rather than be scared of fines and batten down the hatches and lock guys like you down with confidentiality clauses. I think that's going to be very important in the future because, again, this hiding actually doesn't help anybody on the so-called good guy side. To the actual question, it's market forces, isn't it? I mean, I think it was really notable at the RSA show this year and at InfoSec last month how the market is changing over from vendors selling magic bullets and widgets to services providing skills. And incident response obviously is a skilled profession by and large. It requires people. People don't scale terribly well, and that implies that you need more companies providing them. So in your position at BAE Systems, of course, I used to work pretty closely with BAE when I was at Thales. You've got tons of experts, but most people don't. And so actually, is 600 the right number? Is 50% of the UK market the right number? I don't know, that sounds a bit heavy. But is this going to be a well-supplied, skills-based service market for a long time? I think it should be, because most companies can't afford to keep people on staff, but they will need people when stuff happens.
I think I'll just add, I definitely agree with what Dave said in the beginning, that unfortunately, there's no magic wand for validation here. Most companies in this field are going to tell similar stories and they're going to sound similar until you've actually worked with them. So it's going to come down to companies' individual experience. But what often happens is there's a process of weeding out the vast majority of mediocre incident response providers that happens individually by company. I'm not saying it's going to happen across the market like that, but what often happens, I've had many incidents when we were called in after 1, 2, 3, 4, even other incident response providers were brought in to try and deal with the situation. After 24 hours that we're there, everybody else gets kicked out the door. Because then, okay, we have somebody we can trust, we can work with. And from that point on, they know they have their trusted vendor and they can work with us again. But up until that point, it's very hard for management, especially of a completely non-technical company, to be able to analyze. So I think we're really getting two very distinct tiers. We're getting a small number of very good, very specialized incident response companies, and their clientele is growing the more people get their own experience. And then there's a lot of other companies who are going to get a lot of business for a while because there's a lot of attacks coming in, but they're getting weeded out because once you have a bad experience in incident response, you know it because you're not back on your feet, or it's taking too long, or you're not getting the answers you need to, or it's not legally sound so you can't use it with law enforcement later, so you're not going to call them again. And I think in the long term, it's going to make the market eventually shrink back down, maybe not fully, but to some more sustainable level of good companies and not great companies, but not terrible companies.
From this side of the room, thanks.
First of all, thank you all for your time. I'm wondering, is there a control that is available to companies but not widely adopted today that you think will be or should be mandated within 5 to 10 years' time?
Okay, well, shameless plug for my area. Skit is really brand new. It doesn't even have a hashtag, but it's been known for some time and is now completely inescapable that big companies can be infiltrated by attacks in their small supply chain partners. Yes. And historically, significant threat tooling has been too expensive for the small providers to adopt, and so you're just left completely exposed from a security point of view and blind from a visibility point of view. So supply chain transparency initiatives, things like software bills of materials, things like required disclosures, they're being mandated in the US now, and I hope within 5 years they're mandated everywhere because there's no excuse for hiding that kind of stuff.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Most of the incidents that we responded to at NTT last year came from third-party supplier intrusion, and then it escalated to the client that we investigated. So it's very important that, as you asked, there is a measure in place that they have to meet. Because I'm not a compliance-driven person. I'm more like, let's do this. So, but if they have to use compliance to do that, like in order for you to take credit card, like they have the PCI DSS. We do have these things. It's just that people just tick the box. If companies actually follow these compliance rules that are set in place, you find out that we can reduce most of these attacks. So we do have a few of them. I don't know whether people comply to them effectively or they're just ticking the boxes.
Yeah, I think on the regulatory side, it's very complicated to do these things.
Yeah.
When it comes to technical requirements like this. I think one area that's going to be very interesting to see how it develops on the mandate side is everything that has to do with managing insider threats in cybersecurity. I've seen, obviously these are not the majority of attacks, but I've seen more of these. And there's going to have to be some paradigm shift, because when you see somebody who is a security insider, somebody who is, they have the keys to the kingdom essentially, because they're responsible for security or DevOps or something like that within an organization, they're behind an attack, and I've responded to a couple of really unbelievable stories like that, then they're in a position essentially to do anything they want initially. And right now the perspective is this is the position they have to have. But if you look at the banking industry, you go 30 years back, it was a lot easier to embezzle money for a banker than it is today, right? And why? Because they realized that enough is enough, and they put controls in place, both monitoring and dual control, dual approval on stuff that's critical. And I think we're going to have to get to a point where people who are highly privileged in IT and security, there's going to have to be regulations surrounding it the same way that there is in banking, because the potential impact is the same.
Okay.
Lady at the back, please.
Hi. So with increasing attacks on critical national infrastructure and in my dissertation's case, in the energy sector, is quantum cryptography a realistic, impenetrable solution to generate nationwide cyber resilience?
Just to disambiguate the question, do you mean quantum cryptography or do you mean quantum cryptanalysis proof classical cryptography?
I mean, I just want a bit more information, more on the quantum phenomena and future incidents response and how realistic that is. Yeah.
Sure. So for my sins, some of my own fair code is currently running in the UK smart grid in the data processing side. I used to build HSMs and stuff for a living. I think the quantum threat obviously is real. I think it's being handled perfectly well. We've gone through transitions before. We did the 98 transition, we did the 2010 transition, and we can perfectly happily make the 2022 transition in most cases. Now, of course, we also deal, as a colleague from BAE over there will know, I also have some of my code running inside concrete pillars in theatre in various places. You can't upgrade those very easily. But by and large, we'll manage this threat the same way that we did when other crypto went out of date. The biggest quantum threat that people are really panicking about right now is the store now, decrypt later case. So if you just capture all the traffic right now, then at some point in the future, which might be tomorrow or might be in 5 years, it's not terribly far away probably, you'll be able to then decrypt all the key exchanges and then decrypt all of the messages and find out stuff. So if you're keeping secrets right now, that's a problem. If you're just using crypto to protect operations and protect control signals, then it's not a problem because, well, they can't go back into quantum is special, but it can't actually time travel. So you can't go back and unpress a button because the crypto is compromised. So, I don't think the CNI case has anything special over any other sort of government systems or long-term secret systems in terms of quantum crypto. The place where I would worry about it is that there's an awful lot of legacy in there. Like any industry, there's a lot of legacy software and systems that are just hard to upgrade in general. And I would be much more worried about 100 other threats that are currently possible than I would be about the quantum threat, particularly on those cases. So as long as you're not storing blueprints for stuff that needs to be secret for the next 25 years, I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Wow, that was very academic.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. So 2 more questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time, first of all. My question is, with more companies like right now migrating to the cloud, how do you see the future of the incident responses, especially with the shared responsibility model? Thank you. No problem. Shall I repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So my question is, like with more companies right now migrating to the cloud, how do you see the future of incident response going to be, especially with the shared responsibility model and the complexity of the cloud and like, the assets and everything?
Yes, that's actually the next question we're gonna tackle. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you are in the spirit, baby. So, when it comes to incident response, it has evolved. It's no longer that time when you had that one system. Literally every company have moved to the cloud now. So you don't own the disk, for example. So you can't say, give me the image of your disk because there are other customer data on it. So this is where you have to rely heavily on logs. Things like for 365 unified audit logs. And then you have Dockerized environment, and Docker data is very ephemeral, like it doesn't persist. So it's very important that you grab all those logs. It's not when you have an incident that you start thinking of where the logs are. Have a relationship with the supplier, signed agreement. When there is an incident, these are the logs that you're gonna give me. This is what I'm entitled to. And during an incident response, like there was the one that I tackled yesterday, the tool that they were supposed to run, they've already disconnected the system, and because it's in the cloud somewhere, there is nobody physically there to plug back and connect and run. They could no longer connect to it. So if depending on what you are responding to, you need to think fast. Memory, things that are very volatile, get them. You're not gonna. You may get the VMDK file if it's under your control, but most times you won't. That contract is very important. Knowing where to get the logs, and not just when you're having an incident. The contract should allow you to pull logs all the time because that will feed into your threat, monitoring and hunting. Thank you for that question.
I agree. I'll add. I mentioned this before as well. That the main differentiator is just a different attack surface. It's not more difficult. It's not less secure. It's just different. And defenders have to get used to it the same way that attackers do. And the key element there is really just being on top of these specialized kinds of attacks. So I've seen organizations that they see strange code running on a server. They don't understand what's going on. They start investigating. They look at all the connections to the machines, no connections. Look at network connectivity, nothing. They look around, okay, but the attacker used the tool like SSM and AWS, which enables you to run code directly on a server through the API. How? You can't do this on-prem. There's no equivalent on-prem, right? You have to have network connectivity. But here, it just operates differently. It's not less secure. It can be more secure, but it's just a question of adapting the detections and defenses to the same kind of the same kind of new environment. And just one point you mentioned, which is the shared responsibility model. So that's not too relevant to most attacks, just because it's the shared responsibility. The cloud provider is responsible for everything that's not relevant.
Exactly.
They're responsible for making sure that nobody physically breaks into the data center and can. Fine, I trust them to do it. They'll do it well. Yeah. But until they don't, one day, and then the whole internet is going to crash. Okay, when somebody breaks into an Amazon warehouse, but the rest of it is just like having an on-prem environment. You have to treat it like you're responsible for everything and just adapt to the new environment.
Okay. One last question, a quick one, if we can.
Saab's been waiting for ages.
Yeah. Sir.
Just a comment, first of all, and then a question. It was related to safety, and the fact is, when we're talking about IoT, the question that was asked earlier by the lady back there, with so many IoT devices, how can incident response teams sort of figure out what are the intended and the unintended consequences in terms of safety? Because if you look at burglar alarms, fire alarms in particular, and then you look at lighting, that can be used and abused in ways that we may not have thought about. So how do you deal with that? How do you think about the safety aspect when you're having to deal with it?
It's all, again, to do with risk assessment, the value of what you are trying to protect. So if you have that risk assessment, have your threat model, like if it's a power failure, I come from Africa. You guys are living in paradise here. When I did my CCNA exam, I had a baby on my back, and I was on my knee with a kerosene lamp. So if they take off the power station, we can live, we can survive. But when it starts affecting things like oxygen mask in hospital, in theater rooms, or something that we use to protect our defense system, bringing down an aircraft, then it's a different game changer. We have to work. This is not an incident responder program alone, because we are not experts in this field. This is where the engineers and people who develop these systems work with us. We still follow the same model. We detect, we respond. But that has to come from the industry. If the industry doesn't know how the systems work, where the fail systems are, what are the other options, like the plan B? Toast?
Yeah, I don't think that should be an incident response question, because I think most of these things are completely avoidable. There is nobody who builds bridges today who screws them together with stuff they bought in B&Q on a Saturday, because that's okay. We don't have American home insurance laws. But it should be that simple. People should not be allowed to put untested, basic, simple stuff that they don't understand into safety liable equipment. The fact that they do, whether it's IoT, IoT conjures up this idea of hardware and a little thing with a flashing LED and a SIM card in it, but it's all...
I'm struggling to hear them.
Sure, but that shouldn't. So if that just shouldn't be allowed. Part of my earlier answer about software bills of materials and things like that should be to flush out where people have taken shortcuts and start to socially push those out of the fabric of our digital lives.
I think it's unavoidable to have that in many places, and it's just getting more and more. But I think the key answer to this is effective network segmentation. This is something that we see across many organizations. The biggest differentiator between IoT security and IoT being a vulnerability and a keyless seal is this. If you have effective network segmentation, it shouldn't be that big of a problem, because these systems usually don't require much of communication with anything else. So if you have them well segmented, then even if they're completely unpatched legacy systems, million one-day vulnerabilities, if they're well segmented, most likely you're going to be able to prevent an attack through them. And even if an attack comes in, because there should be so little communication with that segment, you can detect it very early. So that's the key to preventing and responding to something like this.
That's the key to a lot of things.
Yeah.
There's a reissue of Pew Voices passed from the IET jointly with CPNI. So I encourage you all to Google it. It's on the IET website. It's been reissued. This time it's got his name on it. We recognise the names of the practitioners there. And these are security guidelines for the built environment. And best of all, this PARS, which is a precursor to a BSI standard, because it's funded, you can all have free PDF. That's my buy.
Yeah, you also have to consider the insider threat. Some of these type of attacks, when we talk about attacks, we are thinking about that stranger that will come from outside. No, he's the enemy within. That type of attack most times. Even if somebody is coming from outside and have a collaborator, they may oftentimes have a collaborator inside. So how do you vet? How do you control access? It's the same model, but different approach, working with the experts in the industry.
So, ladies and gents, that's us. Thanks for your time today. I'd like to thank the panel for attending today and taking the grilling from yourselves, and especially Yotam that we lassoed at the last minute. Just one final note. If you haven't already seen it, CREST have got some vouchers, prize cards for you. At the front desk, if you go around all the vendors, you get some nice voucher or something at the end. Signia's on there. We've got our lovely big stand upstairs.
Sorry, Dave. Sorry. Where's my mic? Before you leave, I'm not marketing or anything like that. But if you are looking for a job or you need to come into IT, security, or anything, you want to get into incident response. Because we don't have enough resources to do this job, not in my company, everywhere. That's why I actually had a baby to add to that supply chain in the future, just in case, yeah. So if you are interested, you need mentoring to get into this job, you need any kind of support in your own job, please connect with us, connect with me. I'm willing to handhold you. We need an army. There is no difference between his company, my company, and his company. We are the same. we're working towards the same goal. So if you need a job in incident response, or you want to change a career, or you know somebody who needs hand-holding, or you're struggling in your job, you don't understand certain topics or area, contact Mama here, and I'll be able to help. Thank you. Yeah.